Father.
Thank you. Ed Tomlinson. All of you mentioned Brexit and Trump as significant events, or I think at least two of the speakers did. And I guess I'd be very interested to know your opinion of whether you think these huge changes signify the beginning of a new era and therefore of maybe some hope from the end of the prevailing chaos, or whether we should expect a backlash that will take us deeper into it, or something else entirely.
Which, Sir Roger, do you want to start?
Well, my view of it, of these two events, is that they are significant. They're significant because they are a challenge to the unspoken orthodoxies of the political class, the people who tend to emerge as our leaders and rulers. And they are, as much as anything, an appeal to take the people seriously, and take seriously the kind of their sense of their historical identity and their entitlements, and not simply to regard the people as a replaceable herd that can be shifted on from pasture to pasture according to the global winds. And I think that what can be done in response is another matter, of course, but certainly there is an appeal that has to be listened to, and it so far has been responded to with great anger by the other side, which is a very interesting thing. People are usually only angry with somebody else when they think that what they're saying is true. Nobody's ever angry with falsehoods. So we have to take seriously the fact that some gestures of reconciliation have to be worked upon. That's my view anyway. So.
Well, I concur. I would just add that it can be a new era. Whether it will be or not, depends on what we do now. Do we, as Sir Roger said, do we listen, or are the powers that be sort of try to quash this gesture? And I think that's the great value of an event like today's, is how can we move this forward in a positive path?
Yes, right up here.
Hello, my name's Paul Towson. If we're to get away from this shame of our own culture and the culture of repudiation, would one of the steps be a disavowal of the kind of universalizing project of liberalism? And I'm thinking particularly of Francis Fukuyama in 1989 when he spoke about the end of history. And it seems an incredibly hubristic attitude that the Western liberal project is the final form of government for the whole of the world. And there's an arrogance there that many other cultures, I think rightly, reject. But how can we reassert confidence in our own culture and history and heritage? And is one of the ways forward by actually accepting a kind of value pluralism, or acceptance that there are other goods in the world other than Western liberal freedoms? So it's really a question of what is a way forward in that context.
Well, I think that we largely have accepted that there are other goods, and the problem is that simply accepting their existence hasn't been enough. It's that we have to abdicate our own good in order for those goods to survive, which I think a little bit gets to what Professor Brague was talking about, and that, I think, is where we run into a problem, that simply acceptance hasn't been sufficient. And that's why you wind up in the situation we are now of having to defend the West. So in our discipline, I think it means being inclusive and intellectually curious, but not self-censoring. So that again,
I wanted to add something to what you said about Rouhani's visit to the Capitoline Museum, it's fine, of course, to want not to offend visiting dignitaries. It's very important that one should do that. But it's also quite important to remind them of their own culture. You know, what are we to say about Hafiz and Omar Khayyam to Rouhani, you know, the great poets of wine? Are we supposed to regard them as somehow not part of Iranian culture just because the present bigots have refused to acknowledge them? You know, I think that they need a lesson in protecting their own culture. But Rémi Brague is a much better expert than me on these sort of things.
Well, thank you so much, Sir Roger. Well, I'm afraid I'm not that competent on Iranian things. You know, my field of least incompetence is rather on the Arabic side of things. And especially, well, I'm sort of familiar with the philosophers who remained very much outsiders in this culture. And it would be good, I could hardly agree more on the necessity for us to remind other cultures of their own past. You know, we don't have necessarily to foist our own cultural goods onto those people, but it would be good for us to, well, to refresh their own memories about the possibilities that lie hidden in them, in order for them possibly to bring new life into those old things, in order to bring those things that remained in the margins to the center of their intellectual pursuits. But this is a very long task and a, well, long story. I'm not sure this would be still possible in the present state of affairs, but we can at least, our responsibility as Western intellectuals would be, well, to keep a living consciousness of this past in order to be able, well, sort of to give it back, if asked, to give it back to its legitimate owners.
Meanwhile, we can drink to it.
Okay, well, let's do that. Why don't we go to the other side here?
Hi there, I'm Peter D. Williams. It seems to me that the root of the loss of self-confidence and the crisis of Western civilization appears to be our loss of a shared conception of the good as opposed to goods, a conception which would allow us to distinguish between true liberty and license on the other, between a genuine exercise of autonomy, virtuous autonomy, versus egoistic solipsism, or an authentic humanism versus the anti-humanism or subhumanism and the excessive humanism that Professor Brague mentioned earlier on. And that was a shared conception rooted in classical and Christian conceptions like Aristotelian teleology, natural law. It seems to me, how can we get past, so this is my question, how can we re-establish a Western civilization and get past this crisis unless we re-establish and reaffirm that basic ideational structure that allowed Western civilization to have its moral force and flourishing?
Who'd like to take that?
Perhaps I should begin, since you were so kind as to quote my own name. Let me be quite cynical as a beginning. Well, the question is, which kind of culture will be able to survive? I mean, to some extent, my outlook is deeply Darwinian. I.e., there is something like a, not natural, but a selection in any case, and the question is about the survival of the fittest. A culture that, loathes itself, a culture that has lost confidence in itself, well, let's say the odds are not that much in favor of its survival, to put it mildly. a culture which regains or possibly could regain confidence and, well, sorry, but pride in itself has better chances to stand the test of time. And for this reason, we, to some extent, haven't anything to do. We simply have to be what we are and to wait for other cultural possibilities simply to disappear. A societies in which birth rates are desperately low, will simply die out. As a species, as an animal species which has lost its props, its fulcrums, and that's only a matter of time. This is quite cynical, I know. I wish I were wrong. I often feel that way. But no, the question about Western culture is whether it will be able to regain this rock bottom confidence in itself in order to keep feeling that its own maintenance is a good thing. If we don't succeed in doing that, well, I'm afraid we'll have to wait for other people to take up and take the gauntlet that we've thrown to them. Well, that's a rather gloomy perspective, but
I don't share this gloom completely. I think
hopefully.
No, I think that
I wish I were wrong. I told you.
All we have to do is take those boxes away from those statues. You know, all over our culture, these boxes are being placed around our statues. Our works of art, our great works of music and literature are being put in inverted commas. You know, just it's up to us teachers to take those inverted commas away and say, look, here is a picture, a portrait of the human condition which ennobles us, and it's ours, so take it. I think it's, there is, obviously, many people lack the confidence to do that. But as I was trying to say, political correctness is all about censoring people who do that. And there's no reason for this censorship. And if people weren't such cowards, it would have no effect.
I would just add, I do think these elections are hopeful in that way, that you have, at least to some degree, a majority of the population who are objecting. And one other quick episode of self-censorship I wanted to mention was, I guess, in September of 2015, when President Xi came to the White House, a group called the Victims of Communism got a permit to protest in Lafayette Square, and the geniuses at the White House put huge white screens around the Rose Garden so that President Xi would not be incommoded by the sight of free Americans exercising their right to free speech across the street. And it was very striking because they looked just like the boxes.
Could I just ask you to elaborate on a slightly different point? In addition to Brexit and the Trump vote, both of which came as a surprise to many, many people.
Me.
Do you see other currents, other indications of something like that, maybe outside of the political realm? Do you see cultural, artistic, literary movements, religious movements that would indicate that this is much more substantial and momentous?
In a funny way, I think my favorite example right now is the musical Hamilton, which is controversial in many ways, and they decided to insert themselves into the election famously. I suppose I should have a disclaimer, my cousin's one of the producers. But it's such an extraordinary statement for Americans to be fascinated by Alexander Hamilton, and for our children to, as I learned about the founders largely from the musical 1776, I mean, the children now know Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison, and I mean, it's not a history lesson in any way, and it shouldn't be taken as such, but they get the basic building blocks, and they become interested in this. And my favorite moment in the play is when Washington retires. Mm-hmm. And it's such a loaded moment because Washington knows that he's the one who can best keep this going. And everyone, including Hamilton, is begging him to stay. And he knows that if he leaves, it could all fall apart, but that he has to if we're going to be a successful republic. And what was great when we saw it a couple of weeks ago was everybody stood up and cheered. And it wasn't just the song. It was quite a moment.
I think a similar case is the way in which Netflix's The Crown is wiping away the BBC. You know?
Couldn't happen to a nicer network.
Yeah.
Beg your pardon. There was a third surprise recently in the so-called primary elections in France. You know, the victory, the unexpected victory of a man who has no special charisma, but who is leading quite a normal family life.
Outrageous.
Yes, it's outrageous. There are many people for whom the very existence of people who who raise a large family and who, well, to be sure, this fellow married an a British woman. It may have contributed a great deal to his achievements, but anyway, well, he might be, I mean, his victory, whether he'll make it at the real presidential elections is quite another story, to be sure. But what is important is that the victory or the success of this gentleman is a symptom of, well, it would be exaggerated to speak of a sea change, but there is a, well, let's say, a move, in my opinion, the right direction among, especially among young Catholic people in France. They, well, they are not more numerous. There are no hosts of converts, you know, flocking to the churches, but a great deal of young people who simply dare, well, come out, make their coming out of sorts, you know, and of a far more outrageous kind than confessing one's own sexual orientations or things like that. They dare speak up, right, and from time to time quite interesting and challenging things, and this is quite a new phenomenon. It was a surprise, including for my humble self. And well, this may be at least a good sign, or this points towards the right direction.
Thank you. I had a question for, my name's Rebecca Morgan. I had a question for Sir Roger. Firstly, I think that anti-nationalism in the UK obviously has a long history, and you just have to look at First World War poetry, I think, to see like the beginning of a death, really, of faith in Britain as a protective nation of its people. And I think that faith has been further destroyed by the assault on the unborn as well. And that there's something that seemed to me a bit circular in what you were saying, in that the nation was defined and good because of its laws, which protected its citizens, but those laws were itself given by the citizens, and And if the idea of freedom, the freedom of the citizen, is defined by the nation, but the nation is defined by the citizen, it seemed to me unclear where the nation derives its values from.
The access to transcendence that you referred to.
Yeah, this is a very good question, and of course I don't want to make of the nation some mystical entity which precedes the individuals that compose it. I would like to say it's like all associations, it's a fluid thing. It's not distinct from its members, but nor is it identical with them. Just the same as a family is not distinct from its members, nor is it identical with them. And people, from what I want to emphasize is that the national idea as we've inherited it, the nation state and all that goes with it, defines loyalty in terms of a system of law and the territory, the sovereign territory over which it is exercised. And this is a fantastic achievement. It's not, our system of law is not laid down by God, who has the huge imperfection that he can't change his mind because he's eternal. Whereas we are governed by our laws that we make ourselves. And that's possible only because we define our association through the territory that we share. We are strangers and neighbors, and I think this is what people felt. There's a lot of literature about in the First World War which shows that people really did feel that. The war poets all had that feeling about England, and same in the Second World War. It was a place, an enchanted place, certainly, but it was because that place demanded their loyalty that they were prepared to fight, side by side with people who did not share their religious beliefs, did not share their way of life, and so on. And I think that I would like to say that that's a great achievement, and we should hang on to it. And maybe it's an achievement more characteristic of the Anglosphere than other parts of the world, but the French have been pretty good at it too.
Thank you. Richard Finn, the Las Casas Institute. If I could ask a question to Dr. Coates, I was very interested in what you had to say about the Capitol. And while I have nothing to say in favour of boxing in statues, I couldn't help wondering, because first of all, one wants to think about what St. Augustine would have to say about the Roman Republic, both the good it achieved, but also his sense of it being under demonic control and being a force of ambition, glory, pride. So that there is within the Western tradition, within our precious values, a profound self-criticism that is uneasy with that Roman heritage. And I couldn't help also thinking then about the remodeling of the Capitol itself, particularly the de-Christianization of it in the attempt to build various sorts of Italy, including Mussolini's Italy. And what you would have to say about the importance of a deep self-criticism within the Western set of values that are important, and a distrust of our institutions as well as a celebration of them.
Well, that's a marvelous question, and one that I've been pondering. I think this answers it. If you look at liberty and the Judeo-Christian moral code and individualism as our foundation stones, it doesn't also mean that they're not our vulnerabilities. And certainly, this notion that liberty can lead to license, that the classical, indeed most attempts at democracy have ended in abject failure. I don't mean to beat up on the French, but there's a reason they get 2 chapters in my book. So that's not, it's not inevitable. And it's not always good. And so you can have that. In our moral code, the fact that we will behave a certain way can be exploited by our enemies because they won't. And that's in many ways one of my key criticisms of our current administration's foreign policies. They keep assuming others are going to act the way we would act, and they don't, and that's a problem. And then in terms of the individual, if you do value each individual, it's an enormous vulnerability when you're coming up against an enemy who has no value for any individual. So I think our challenge is to protect our vulnerabilities while exploiting these things for our strength. And I would push back a hair on the restoration of the Capitoline under the Farnese Pope, because I don't think Paul had any feelings of de-Christianizing. I mean, the Oracoli is kept very carefully. That area that they redo was really the market in front of the town hall. It didn't, the Capitoline proper, where the Marcus Aurelius should be, not the copy. That was not particularly Christian space, to my understanding of how it was used, and the antiquities were all kind of lying around there anyway. I mean, the Marcus Aurelius was there, and I guess they brought over the giant hunks of Constantine. But that was a papal project, and I don't think they conceived of it as de-Christianizing. I think they conceived of it as placing ancient Rome at the service of papal Rome. Mussolini's another question.
Let's go to the middle, right there, right here.
Lovely, thank you. Hi, my name is Janina White. I'm Russian, so I believe that my question is to Sir Roger. Yeah, there is a beautiful Russian expression that slaves, they don't really would like to be free. They don't like to achieve freedom. They like to get other slaves. So I'm here because of the words economics in the title. So I listened very carefully what all of you said, and I listened to this case of Rotherham girls and this case of Iranian president, and I can see that actually this self-censoring and self-restriction cases had quite significant economic element, because, for example, in Iranian president case, it was like 20 billion or something dollars on the table. And as we know, in Rotterdam, there are quite rich, significant Muslim communities. So my question is that, you know, I happen to be married to a British politician, and he voted for Brexit. So I'm listening all the time at political gatherings that actually British national identity is paramount, and British laws and finances should be controlled back by the community and other things. And the very last 5 seconds of each conversation would be like, oh, you're Russian, can you recommend me a Russian plumber who can do the job twice cheaper than a British professional? So my question to you is, in terms of the economics, if they are so paramount that people, apparently, they are putting self-inflicted censoring on themselves only for the sake of getting some financial benefits, do you think that there should be some kind of better principle of economics to be considered and introduced, so this pressure is not so paramount? Thank you.
Well, that's a very elaborate and interesting question. My view is that that we have made a mistake, beginning roughly with Karl Marx, in thinking that economics is what politics is all about, and that the rest is just an epiphenomenon. You know, that all the rest is simply ideological superstructure. I think, on the contrary, that politics is not primarily about economics. It is about that which holds people together in a community, and all the many things like law and custom and religion and so on are part of it. And economics is a byproduct, much more than the foundation, as Marx thought. And if you get the law right, then, you know, as we've seen in our country, the economics comes out right as well. You know, a free economy is one in which people are held to their contracts, and in which you can't bribe your way out of a deal or into one either. What we are seeing, of course, in the international sphere, in the case that Dr. Coates mentioned, is a different conception, where economics means shifting around huge fictitious quantities of unreal estate from one impoverished brain to another. And it sometimes has good effects, sometimes bad. But in the case of Rotherham, the economics was only that, of course, a police officer would lose his job, possibly, if he was accused of political incorrectness. So there is an economic factor there. But there is also the much more important factor that if all police officers had got together and said, we won't let any of you be fired by those politically correct sociologists who run the town council, then it would have been okay.
I actually just had a quick thing to add to that, because I didn't get to pontificate as long as I usually like to about the Florentine Florin and its integration into the Renaissance, that no Florin, no Michelangelo. And I think that's an important point, but at the same time, what we've learned from the Iranians, the Chinese, and our good friends in Cuba is that you can flood a totalitarian society with capitalism, but political liberalization does not naturally follow. It's a nice idea. It would be fun to think that that works, but it doesn't. And so I think that's a very important concept to keep in mind as we go forward.
Hello, I'm Amanda Acton, and my question is, how can we promote a truly human vision of community when combating the non-recognition of reality with respect to gender theory and the identity politics necessarily involves so much division and dissent? And what are some examples of that inspiring, attractive communities, such as this idea of the police officers sort of banding together to support, like some sort of solidarity? Do we see examples of communities with solidarity against political correctness that are themselves attractive to those who seem to value community and belonging so much?
Wow. It's a challenge to find, of course, centers of resistance where normal, natural people are standing against ideologically motivated oppression. Because normal, natural people don't have ideology, they just have affections. But I know of one such community, which is my own local fox hunt. The Vale of White Horse Hounds, of which my wife is the proud master. It's a community of natural people, mostly farmers and labourers and people like that, who just love a particular activity and know that they're under attack from ideologically motivated people, and for the first time in their life have had to confront the adverse effect of ideas on minds ill-prepared to receive them. But they've survived.
Yes. Should we go over there? I'm trying to kind of move around the room as much as I can.
My name is Richard Turnbull. I want to ask a question about the relationship of Christianity and culture, which I think so far has been implicit rather than explicit. So, Roger, you ended your talk with an excellent articulated defence of the nation state, but I noticed you described both faith and family as private. And then, Victoria, you began your talk by referring to the role of faith and Christianity as part of the culture that we seek to defend. So could you comment, therefore, on the role, the public role of our faith, of Christianity, of the moral law that that brings about, and the role that that has played in the very cultural expressions that we're seeking to defend?
Thank you.
Sure.
Whoever. Let's each of you. Why don't we?
Yeah, this is such a big question.
Yes, it's going to require all three of you.
I would limit my remarks to my field. I mean, I think the development of the moral code of which you speak is defining for our civilization, and the way I'm approaching it is through the visual record, because Christianity has a unique compulsion amongst the monotheistic religions to create images of the divine, and those images have actually, like the Transfiguration, played active roles in the history of Illuminate. But I would leave the larger questions to the philosophers.
I would say only that I recognize that without Christianity, Western civilization wouldn't exist. And one of the things that I esteem about it, namely the growth of a secular jurisdiction, is one I think we owe to Christ himself in the parable of the tribute money, when he told us to give unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. I think that was set the standard for a religion which is essentially governing that aspect of life which is not defining the public sphere. But it's true that it's only because Christianity has invaded the public sphere that we have so much order in it, so much moral order in it. I like to believe that had Christianity prevailed in the minds of the German and Russian people during the 20th century, the Gulag and the Holocaust would not have occurred. But I may be wrong. I mean, unfortunately, as we know, religions can feed people's criminality just as much as they can suppress it. So.
Well, if I may contribute my mite to this quite interesting discussion, I should begin with saying that there is something highly paradoxical about the relationship between Christianity and culture. On the one hand, the implicit quotation by T.S. Eliot that if Christianity would go, well, Western culture would go either, well, is deeply true. But on the other hand, there is no such a thing as a Christian claim to the whole realm of culture, no attempt at controlling. And if we look backwards, when Christianity appeared, there were two complete systems of culture competing, i.e. the so-called Greek and Roman, which was in the process of which you had on the path of moral, social, economic and political behavior. You can deduce from the 613 commandments of the Torah a whole system of life, a whole way of life. In Hebrew, that's halakha, the way, you know, the path you have to follow. And there's something like that in Islam as well in later times. I mean, the Sharia is the answer to each and every possible question about the right choice to be made in everyday life. How you have to wash yourself, how you have to choose your garments, how you have to shave or not shave your beard and mustachio, and so on and so forth. You know, everything is there. When Christianity appeared, Saint Paul introduced a radical change in that. He said, well, in a word, we'll content ourselves with the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments, which are hardly more than the basic survival kit of mankind, of any society. You can't imagine a society in which mutual killing, mutual pilfering, mutual cheating would be allowed. That's the rock bottom conditions of any human society. For the rest, well, Christianity trusts human intelligence, human freedom, such as it is, enlightened by what Christian people call divine grace. And by the way, I seize the opportunity to make a short remark on the idea of a law that would come from God. Christians And Jews and Muslims all believe that the law, ultimately, in the last analysis, comes from God. The difference are the channels through which it is conveyed to human beings, i.e., in the case of Christianity, there is the mediation of human conscience, of human freedom, to which God entrusts, sort of, the choice of the right answer in front of this or that problem of everyday life. What shall I eat? How shall I clothe myself? How shall I marry? And so on and so on and so forth. And there is a religion, especially Islam, to which we alluded already, in which those norms are supposedly dictated from God without any mediation in human conscience. Human conscience can only play a minimal part in the margins, but never as the source of moral obligation, which is the case in Christianity. And this is, by the way, the reason why, well, people who were brought in a Christian culture can do away with a reference to the source of morality in God and can, well, put up with, well, let's say the basic moral roots without their having to look upwards in the direction of its possible divine origin. When we say, when Rousseau, not my fellow countryman, who was a citizen of Geneva, not yet Swiss, let alone French, when he said conscience, divine instinct, immortal and heavenly voice, well, this has to be taken at face value. Conscience is the way in which, for Christian people, God speaks. He has not to dictate a book or to give his prophet as an example. Conscience is sort of enough. Well, I should have to develop this, but I would have to rewrite Aquinas's questions 90 till 94 of the Prima Secundae, and this would lead us too far.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank the speakers.